I have friends who work at like much higher levels, like director levels and things like that, and they just tell me like, yeah, when I interview um, people who have been in an industry longer, what I notice is somebody who's experienced will always tell me exactly what they want to work upon, right? It'll be like very specific, like I want to do back end work with Golang on specifically like this problem domain. And they're like, okay, well, we can find a spot for you.
Welcome, everybody. Today's guest is Kenny. He is a software engineer working for a venture-backed startup based out of the US. He graduated from a coding bootcamp in 2016 and also studied additionally at a computer science bootcamp in 2019. He's worked across the entire stack, front end, back end to infrastructure, and is just an all-round, well-traveled guy. All right, Kenny, how you doing today?
Pretty good. How about you?
Good, man. Good. Um, so I guess we'll jump straight into it. So tell me a bit about your current role that you've got and what that kind of involves for you.
So right now, my current role is mainly in feature product development, but the way the company's organized is that I kind of get a little flexibility to work on a little bit of everything. So I would say my main focus is backend development with the Golang language, but I also get to dabble a bit in front end development if I wanted to, depending on the feature. And I also get to dabble in infrastructure as well. So it's a little bit of a all-round engineer kind of structure.
What would you say your current split across those different sort of skills
Yeah.
are?
So I would say on a day to day, on average, I work about 60% back end, 20% front end, and 20% infrastructure.
And like for this particular role, is that something that you looked for? Like you wanted to be able to work on everything? Was there a specific outcome that you were really looking for as like your day-to-day work?
Actually, in a weird way, I think I got a bit lucky. I think when I was interviewing, they knew exactly what I was capable of, and the company had a structure or a culture of more of, if you see any problems, we empower you to fix it. And they liked the fact that I did full stack and also dabbled in infrastructure, so they knew that um, me joining the company would help them identify potential problems in like inefficiencies in productivity or workflow and process related to infrastructure or things like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So with that kind of flexibility and what this sort of role offers you, is that something you planned for when you were seeking it out, or did it kind of emerge organically?
I would say it really emerged organically. It's first started off with doing nothing but feature development. And in working in feature development, I started to see some, I guess I would say, inefficiencies in processes, or not necessarily inefficiencies, but just certain things that I may not necessarily agree with. And as a pure product developer, I felt like I had less influence to enact those kind of changes. And that naturally uh, pushed me in the direction of seeking more productive ways to work. But overall, I think I just like helping people in general. So that kind of just naturally moved me in that direction. Yeah.
So when you talk about like having that influence over the process and the thing, are you talking like the how software is delivered from like a project management process thing, or are you talking more like technically like the automation, DevOps infrastructure type thing? Is that is and when you say this, do you mean your exactly your current company, or is this something a trend that's more emerged across multiple jobs?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a trend across multiple jobs. So for me, it could be anything from because as somebody who's just freshly enters a company, you have no idea how things work. So just onboarding in general is something I really care about. So, and then when I talk about onboarding, I talk about specifically like setting up your environment locally. How hard is that? And most of the times it's pretty damn hard. I've had it range anywhere from 1 hour to a week to setting up your local environment, depending on which company I was with. And there are also other things like the first feature that I'm going to develop. How hard is it to actually develop a feature and feel confident about the work that you did, right? And I feel like those are the things that I tend to care about. And for example, one thing that is just coming up with ways to have a better way of seeding data in local development and things like that.
Nice, nice. So
Yeah,
would you say in your current position, this is where you've been able to have a lot of impact and all of that stuff?
yeah, definitely.
And has it always been that way? Like, I guess sounds like it's one of the better organizations for that. But given, I totally agree, this can be a massive frustration where, onboarding and being productive and understanding how to work, not just like on the software project, but how it's delivered, how it's tested, how to debug it, like how do you get access to, logs and things like that. All these things are really important to
Mhm.
being effective at your job. Um, and you mentioned that it's been a trend like thing. So in the companies where it was a lot longer, were you able to have an impact there as well?
Um, at it really depends because at other companies, I may be working in a structure where I'm purely a feature developer, and in those cases, deadlines are much more. I would say the deadlines were a lot more strict and more rigid. So it was more about producing something for business to see, and that, as a result, created more technical debt and made it more difficult to come up with essentially work that could improve our state of the world for us to just feel more productive and happy with the work that we're doing.
And maybe we'll touch on this a bit later when we maybe dive into a bit of like what each role was and the progression through your career. But do you think having been through that is maybe what encouraged you to get involved in more infrastructure and that side of the work where your role is directly working on the systems that allow for effective and reliable delivery of software?
Yeah, so I definitely think that the reason why I moved in that direction was also just my curiosity. Like I felt like when I was doing feature development, especially with a framework like Rails, I felt like I was only building extensions on top of an existing tool. So it's kind of like the framework's here, you just build something, you already know how controllers work, you know how to build a model, you know how to migrate your database. And a lot of that is like your hands are held throughout the entire time by the Rails framework. It's actually very interesting when you start to code in like Golang, like not you have none of those things to help you. You have to figure all of that stuff out by yourself. So yeah, when I and during those times, I really felt like I had huge gaps in my knowledge in just software in general. I just felt like in order for me to fill those gaps, I really needed to pursue other categories uh, like you said, like secure, like effective delivery of code and products and things like that, and also being part of uh, the infrastructure was one of the steps that I thought would help me, especially in like software design or overall architectural design. Yeah.
Nice, nice, nice. So maybe let's go through a bit of a timeline, and if you could tell me, what your story was. So, it's 2016. You've graduated from a boot camp. Where did you land like after that?
Yeah. So, so in 2016, during the boot camp, I was an extreme tryhard. I really, really wanted to get employed, and luckily, because of uh, just honestly like the help from my mentors at that boot camp and things like that, I was able to feel fairly confident in what I was doing. So by then, before I even finished the program, I did get offered a job at this really small startup. It was a company size of like 5 people, just somebody who had an idea and was building a product and already had a huge network and just wanted to share that with her network. And that team was just me, one senior engineer, and another junior developer. And we worked in PHP on the Code Igniter framework.
Nice,
And
nice, nice. And and do you feel like that was a good experience for your first job? Like, did you
Yeah.
get a lot of like growth there? Because I know there can be quite a range between there's this kind of matrix of like what you're allowed to work on when you first start and how much support you get. Like it's like
Yeah.
it's open and supported, and then there's kind of like it's you can sit in different quadrants of that. How do you feel that kind of worked with you? Was it open-ended and supported to a level that you wanted?
Yeah, so that I actually really cherish that experience because straight out of boot camp they tell you like you should what we're really training you to be is to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So after the boot camp you just really have to know what you can or cannot do, right? And of course, being straight out of boot camp, there are a lot of things that you cannot do. So luckily when the team is that small, it's also very easy to build a rapport with your coworkers. And especially when like the owner of the company, the CEO, tells me like, hey, I want this feature built and I want it to be able to do this, I can tell her right away like these are the tools that I will need to be proficient in order to do this. And right now my SQL knowledge is like really basic. So I can tell you that maybe for the senior developer, it'll take her maybe less than a day or two to crack this like feature out. For me, I will probably need maybe 3 or 4 days, maybe even a week, because I need to first like skill up on the basics and fundamentals before I can tackle this problem. And I think the best thing about starting out a job and being really nervous and all that is to help with that is to just set those expectations, right? Just tell them straight up, I don't know. But I'll tell you how I can know, and this is what I believe I need to do to know that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you touch on a really important point there. Is it's like it's saying where you don't know is obviously the first step, but
Mhm.
following up and saying, here's what I need to do to know, and asking for permission for that to be part of your work. Because I
Yeah.
think you know ideally you're at an organization that respects that when you're a junior, there has to be some kind of allocation and time and resources for you to acquire this knowledge. It's just not always suitable to learn on the
Yeah.
feature you're going to release. There's just sometimes theoretical concepts or gotchas that you need to be made aware of first and different things. So that's really interesting. So from there, so what you're moving along. What kind of inspire? So you're moving on, and how long were you there for?
I think I was there for a good year, maybe almost hitting 2. I can't really remember. It's I think it's probably a year. Yeah, I
Yeah,
would say 1 year. I was there for 1 year, and honestly, I learned programming through JavaScript and Ruby and through the Rails framework. So I actually really like the Ruby language. So at the time when I was working in PHP, PHP gets so much flack, and I can understand why. But also being a junior, I didn't know better. So like I was like, it's a good enough language to do some OOP stuff. I have a framework holding my hand. I can do some basic jQuery and stuff. But yeah, you do realize only in retrospect, after moving on to other companies, I started to see like, oh man, I'm so glad I don't work in jQuery anymore or something like that. But yeah, what motivated to the next company was essentially I prefer to work in Ruby, and the next company that I was interested in also was a fintech company. So it seemed like the problems that they're solving are much bigger and more complex. The size of the company was also much larger too. So to me, it was kind of like a huge move up. And in that sense, yeah, it that was mainly why I moved there. Got to work with React, got to work with Rails, and
yeah, nice,
yeah.
nice. So you talk about the transition there. So when you were getting ready to look for your next role, was that born out of a frustration with your current role? Was there limitations to your growth, or like you said, you just knew that you wanted to work with like a particular technology
Mm.
like Ruby? Like what kind of what was the trigger? What triggered that transition?
Yeah, I would really say it is that like thirst for knowledge. I feel like when I worked at that company, again, it's very small. There's no official process in any how anything is delivered. It's really just at the whim of what the CEO wants, and sometimes they'll just pivot and want a completely different product. But more or less, I felt like I got really comfortable with the code base, and that was like within about 3 to 6 months. And by that time, I was like, okay, all I'm doing is very like finicky jQuery front end stuff, and then it's just SQL query, and the stuff in the backend servers are very straightforward. So uh, that got really it felt really repetitive because it's just like you're not really like it's not really saying, oh, build me a cool feature that will solve this kind of problem in this new domain. It's like we're in the same problem domain and there isn't that much variety in what you're doing. So eventually I did feel like I was outgrowing the company. And yeah, that was part of and I also believe that you shouldn't just stick with the first job that you're working in unless like they have an amazing learning environment. But I just find like you are only doing yourself a service if you're trying to expand your horizon by learning more languages and things like that.
And would you say around this period, was your focus, purely around this growth, or was there, did you have some concerns about like you wanted to earn more, you wanted to find ways, like was that becoming an issue or something that was something you wanted to get, or is just you're primarily just looking for to optimize growth of it, like, skill acquisition and career growth?
Yeah. Yeah, and I definitely think like starting out, I had no idea what I wanted to specialize in. I honestly, I only thought software was full stack, like front end, back end, or full stack. That was like the limit of what I knew about software. I didn't even know infrastructure existed. All these other roles, like machine learning, data, like dev, and all those other like categories, I didn't know that existed. Right, I was just working in a small shop that was essentially building like some sort of like WordPressy kind of stuff. So yeah, the pay was never something I was focused on, especially in the beginning, because I just thought that like having that beginner's mindset, it's all about figuring out what environment you want to be in that will like accelerate your growth. Yeah.
Nice, nice, nice. Okay, so you've moved into a new role from what was kind of a scrappy startup with things seemed like they were very by the seat of your pants, and it was
Yeah.
um, pretty what would the word be, um, low process sort of tech company.
Yeah.
And then in your next role, on top of being able to engage with different technologies and in a different space, like you said, fintech. Um, what other like big challenge, like changes happen there, like growth opportunities, and the environment? What did the new environment bring to you?
Um, so one thing that I thought was really cool about that opportunity was actually that I got to work with React, because I knew it was like state of the art fancy front end framework at the time, and I just thought like, oh man, like all I did was like typical CSS, jQuery stuff, and um, never worked with like a rich client framework. And yeah, joining that company, I got to work with React. And one thing that I really liked about the company was I got to say that like, hey, I feel super overwhelmed, because like keep in mind that I just have 1 year of experience under my belt, and I just remember saying I am extremely overwhelmed. Um, I have no idea how to like get my foot in, because like 2 months in, I like was still pair programming, but like had no idea how to contribute. So eventually I said like, I need to figure out a path that I can help me learn effectively to understand the business logic of the company better. And that's when I also approached like my manager at the time. I just said like, I would like to work in front end specifically. I just want to take one piece of this company and be able to feel very confident in it and like know this domain. And it's kind of like breaking down the problem, right? Instead of trying to tackle everything at once in the system, I'd say, let me first focus on front end. And I believe I did front end for about like the first like 8 or 10 months. And before I decided to tackle full stack, like back end and things like that.
Yeah, that's really cool. So like you identified that there was too much. There was too much technology.
Yeah.
It was all coming at you at once, and you realized that this wasn't actually, you weren't actually growing from it. It was like at the point where the breadth of work, even though in some cases that can be very liberating and interesting, that
Yeah.
you get like a lot of exposure, you ultimately reflected, which I think is really amazing that you were able to do this, and said, I need to pick, like slice one thing off and just
Yeah.
get good at that. So that's really awesome. So you're on front for 8 months, and then so you're doing that, and then at the end of that, so you transitioned over to the back end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously my goal is to try to learn as much as I can. It's not necessarily saying I just want to focus on the front end, but of course that I was what I felt most comfortable with. One was because it's also like a matter of deciding who you want to work with too. And at that time, the person who was managing the front end was a very good mentor from just my limited interactions with him. And I just thought like, hey, this guy will be able to create that learning environment that I was looking for. And yeah, after working in the front end, I moved on to working in the back end. And because I already had so much experience in the front end, I knew exactly what the API would look like in the back end and what the payload structure should look like and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't too difficult to transition afterwards, because it's like I already know exactly how to manipulate the client world to get the information that the back end needs. Now I just need to understand how the back end is going to process information before like shooting it to the database or wherever else it needs to go. So it was just like, now I understand the front end, I can be very comfortable maneuvering in the back end. Yeah.
And I'm guessing, and then was it within this role you started to identify, like, you've got more experience, like you've come out of this thing like, I just don't know what's going on. You've gained some competencies in the front end. And that has, given you the foundation to then pursue competencies towards the back end and with the database and other areas. But I'm assuming at some point now you've been like, well, front end, back end aside, there are some significant challenges in like delivering this software to the users. And I would imagine this may have been where, you might have started to see your first interest in like, what are the, like, that the job of delivering, like there's actual jobs involved in making the process of delivering software effective, and their development roles as well.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to pinpoint like a specific example of what that may be, because there's always this kind of like push and pull between like business and engineering, right? Like business always wants a product, they want visibility on the product and they expect it to be done in a certain time frame. And engineering is always this force that's saying like of telling them, is this actually doable? Is this not? And they kind of push back and forth. What I noticed was some things in productivity issues was just like something as simple as the fact that you still have to deploy something manually from your local machine every time to like staging or production. I believe production was like eventually like walled off very soon, but it's just little things like that where it's like, not only do you have to learn to set up your local environment and then get productive and do all these kind of things, you might even you have to figure out how to deploy something where ideally, now that I have experience working in infrastructure, I know that, hey, I can actually automate that process for you. So you never need to worry about all of these other things. You start to realize that the reason why you have to manually perform certain tasks that are like beyond your knowledge world is because maybe the design of that particular task by the person who's responsible for it did not really fully encapsulate it into a black box that basically makes it so that you don't have to worry about that anymore, if that makes sense. It's like something in their consideration bled over to now your domain of work. So now it has to be your problem as well. And I just feel like that that's kind of, I started to like, I guess you would say it's more of trying to observe the company or the process in like more of a systems thinking kind of framework. So then you can be like, hey, this affects this affects this. Should this actually affect this? It's like, not really. Like ideally, this should just be on its own. And when you start to see those kind of things, it's like, oh wow, like if I had just more experience in, for example, working with like task runners, like CI tools and platforms like AWS and stuff, I would have the ability to make those changes and help people be more productive. Like I can deliver that value by myself. But when I'm only in the product sphere, it's a lot harder. It was a lot harder for me at the time to be able to influence that change because I was only allowed to work on the backend framework or something like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel as well that you don't realize this until you get more experience working on the infrastructure side of things and participating in, things like release engineering and stuff like that. How much choosing the right infrastructure, and then how that influences how you like design your coding. Like, when you first get into coding, it's kind of all, handled for you by more senior developers. But as you start to encounter it yourself, you realize that like it's a very important variable, not just in like, how that affects the company's product and just, you need to run it out in the cloud or on servers, but it affects how you plan and design your actual deliverable work. Now, sure, that may not influence directly how you code up, say, an individual React component, but it's going to influence like how you configure Webpack and how you decide that, that asset's being compiled, deployed, and like maybe put on a CDN and stuff, which isn't the kind of thing you have to work on day to day necessarily when you're a junior or even as senior, but it's one of those high leverage decisions that you're impacted by. If that release process for the UI is clunky, even if you're a junior, you can be caught off by that every day.
Yeah. And I think the hardest part about being a junior is that like you don't know to be easy on yourself. Like for example, maybe you think you suck, but maybe it's the process that sucks. Like the process is so convoluted and so difficult that it ends up making you feel very unproductive. And then you're thinking like, oh, like why am I so bad at this? But it's like, oh, actually, here are all of these other variables that are influencing how something is released. And therefore, it actually makes you 20-30% slower than you think you should be. But as a junior, you wouldn't know that. You would just be like, oh, why am I not releasing this feature by Friday?
I would even like go a step further and say that the process is like almost the most important, and that when the processes are have a lot of friction and are bad like that, the people who are unaware of that from like a systems perspective and start pointing fingers at individuals or groups, it's really unfair, because often those individuals or groups are their worst selves because of the processes and the system within which they work. And had the system been addressed and dealt with correctly, the kind of interpersonal frictions that arise out of a poor system often disappear in my experience. Like you tidy up a few of the like pull request systems, automate a few things. I've been amazed at how many interpersonal conflicts just immediately evaporate through like adding the right kind of automation and checks into the balances. So literally people can't make certain kinds of mistakes and things like that where people get very upset about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just think like it's sometimes it's like it's not even like, oh, you need this super expensive tool to do something. It's just like, let's just set a few rules and this will eventually be the culture of how things are. And it's less about everybody has their own special way of doing something, and people bump heads and things like that. Yeah. I totally get it.
So nice. So So at this particular company, did you get to make many changes around these processes and infrastructure, or is it's more just the
Uh,
observations that you were able to
no,
make?
there were definitely observations. I did not have the opportunity to be a part of the infrastructure. I think I did recall asking to be able to join that team, but again, like permissions in a company as well. Being a backend developer, you don't get to see too much of what's in the AWS framework. And the funny thing is, after I started moving to the infrastructure team, I realized how many things were hidden from me as an AWS user, right? But I didn't know anything about AWS at that time.
Yeah.
All I was building was in the Rails world. So it's just like, you know, it's so interesting because you were talking about like, oh, as a senior developer, you need to consider like, how to configure your app and things like that. And the question is even like, how do you design your app so it's easy to configure, right? and
Big
and
time.
that's like, sometimes people just hard code a bunch of things like, yo, API keys in here, and you're like, what's going on? Why is this even here? So there's a bunch of things where you're just like, whoa, I never knew. Like, again, if I were a junior joining this company, I'd just be like, oh, I guess this is just the way things are. But like when you get more experience in different domains, you're like, whoa, this shouldn't be here, and I don't know why. And if we fix this, like maybe the infrastructure team now has a much easier time containerizing this, and they can release our product quicker or faster. And those are all things that like you just wouldn't know if you just stayed, I don't know, being like only working in one domain. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say they influence each other. Like because of this infrastructure knowledge, it's made you both a better front end and back end developer. The same way that like some of your knowledge transferred into the back end, but also as you get better at back end, you are able like each of those disciplines makes you better at the others, which is not immediately obvious until you start to gain some skills in those. But there's a lot of it's kind of this weird balancing act between you can't do it all at once, so it makes sense. You've got to start somewhere, and each of these areas have quite a lot of knowledge to gain in all of them. Like the days where people just starting off with full stack developers is been evaporating over the years just because of the complexity that's been introduced into each part of those sections. But being able to push yourself through the multiple places where the software is being touched and being used, I think holistically makes you you end up with like it synergizes. The whole ends up being greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, and this is not to say that you shouldn't specialize. I still think like the whole point of me exploring is so that I can eventually choose to specialize. But I do think that what my takeaway from this, or I hope people take away from this, is that like you should stay curious, right? You should want to know everything, or try to, because maybe this piece of nugget will not serve you now, but later on you'll be like, oh yeah, I ran into this problem before. This is something that I definitely can tackle, or things like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you've been at this organization for a minute, and then at some point you transition into a new role.
Mhm.
So sort of what drove the decision, like for the next
Yeah.
opportunity, and what was that opportunity?
Yeah, so after working on mostly like Rails and React, I wanted to dive more into infrastructure. And after that, I moved on to working at an American company and I joined the infrastructure team. I think it was only like a team of, eventually ended up being a team of four. But that was one of the most fun jobs I've had. I, I I think working in infrastructure is truly entertaining and fun. Like you get your responsibility is very clear, which is really helpful. I feel like usually when you work in product, there's a little bit of a push and pull between you and business in determining deadlines, and like also even the scope of the work, right? But in infrastructure, usually at least in my limited experience, it was very clearly defined what we're in charge of, right? Like your sole responsibility is to basically empower developers to be productive and do the work that they need to do. And you need to make sure that things don't burn. That like those are the only two things you need to worry about, right? And like your job is really to make sure that you eventually like deprecate your own job. Like you become obsolete because eventually you set up automated alerts or things like that so that you don't need to bug developers anymore. Like it's just like, oh yeah, the alert channel already notified them, like I can go have my coffee or whatever. Yeah.
So I feel like that can go both ways depending on the organization, in the sense that
Yeah.
you could be the hero of the technical team where you're making everyone's life easier,
Yeah.
or you
Yeah.
could very quickly become the scapegoat for
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
all system failures.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's very important to choose a company that doesn't have blame culture, right? Because yeah, it's very you don't want to join a company that's gonna point fingers, and you want to join a company where everybody knows that we're all here to do good things together. We're not here to like, I don't know, be a rock star programmer and make other people feel bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. So that's really cool. So you've moved. So this is like a full-time infrastructure role, and for people that don't really understand what that means versus front end, back end, that's still a development coding role, correct? Like even though you're working with
Yeah.
servers, you're working with AWS. That I know that still would also overlap with what people would call DevOps, which is an accurate term as well. But I personally view DevOps as a philosophy and
Yeah.
I wouldn't go as far
Yeah.
as to call it a process, but it's a philosophy that inspires a certain perspective on release processes and integration. But yeah, I don't think everyone is immediately aware that that infrastructure work is like a development role, and it's an option.
Yeah. Yeah. And the things that you can specialize in are just huge, right? Like there are so many categories. Like it would be really hard to name them all, but like even like there's like SRE, like these are all like little subcategories of DevOps, like SRE, release engineering. Yeah, I don't want to go on about it, but like cloud programming, all of these things are under the infrastructure umbrella. But like you can be so well versed in one of these categories and not know as much about the other, right? And to just say I'm an infrastructure engineer doesn't necessarily mean that I'm an expert in all of those roles. It's more like I'm probably going to be, depending on your role in the company too, I'm probably going to be a specialist in this, a generalist in this,
Yeah.
and yeah.
Because like even doing that, like you may not necessarily be like you may be rolling out stuff that spins up like virtual server VPSs and things like that, but you might not be like particularly advanced at say Linux, even though
Yeah.
like your job touches at that level a lot more. That it's not like you're operating that old school
Yeah.
IT administrator role. It's very much like it's a coding role that happens to have a more direct interaction with those components.
Yeah, and I would say what you become proficient in is what the company needs from you at the time. So whatever problem they're solving at the time is what you will be proficient in. So maybe you will never need to worry about alerting because you're not, maybe the company's not even live yet. So you
Yeah.
could be an infrastructure engineer for a company that never needs to worry about building alerts. So yeah.
Yeah. Nice, nice, nice. So yeah, you're out there, you're doing infrastructure, and this, it's been an interesting thing. But having known a little bit about your story and what's going on, this particular role ends in a more inorganic way.
Yeah, so as we all know, we're living in the times of COVID, and I loved working at that company, but unfortunately, our target market were essentially people who got hit the hardest by COVID. So as a result, the company had to terminate, and yeah, because of that, I uh, went on my next job search.
Nice, nice, nice. And I get this question a lot, from a lot of students that I teach, and a lot of anxiety around what it's like in a pandemic world. My current personal perspective on it is that we've had a little bit of time now, and many companies have started to adapt to remote processes. So they're back to sort of hiring again, and companies that have survived are sort of stabilized. Then, some jobs may have been wiped out, but I think there's been some new opportunities created by the world, the changes in the world. So I don't have any actual data on this, but my anecdotal observation is the tech space is kind of like it's neutralized out. Like some went, some went down. It's kind of balanced out. So I think that, but what's your kind of field? Did you find it particularly hard finding a new role in this
Mm,
like a pandemic world,
yeah.
or how did that work for you?
So I'll be honest, like most of the times when I've transitioned from job to job, I was actively looking, or not actively looking, but just open to new opportunities. And usually those opportunities landed on my plate without me like searching so hard, so vigorously. So my first job, I already had an opportunity knocking on my door from a friend, and I accepted that and got to move on to that company, and naturally for the other one as well. So this was actually my first experience actually like saying, hey, you're from like an empty slate now and you just got to look for a job. I would say the hardest thing is actually understanding, trying to match your expectations with the reality of the world for job hunting, right? Like, and I thought, because coming from job hop, like not job hop, from going job to job, I was like, oh, okay, it should be fairly easy for me to get employed, right? Being a software developer is pretty in demand. I was like, okay, it'll be fine, it'll be smooth. And honestly, it was like really nerve wracking. It was probably one of the most stressful few months of my life.
So even though you've got several years of experience across
Yeah,
many areas and your skills were up there, um, it's like the whole like, and I like to actually like think of the front door, what I would call, what you describe as the front door approach to
yeah,
getting a job versus the, coming in the back door where you've got like a connection at the
yeah,
organization, or, they've sought you out. Like there's already like you've got a foot in the door. Um, the front door approach is to me a bit of a little bit like attrition warfare. Like you're throwing out your resumes, you're going to interviews, and it's like it's a whole different beast. I personally try to use it as like a last resort, because I not only because it's just more time consuming talent and challenging both technically and emotionally, that like I get a lot of personal nervousness around like not having direct insights into what that organization's actually going to be like. So
hmm,
how did you like even navigate that part? Like, it's one
yeah.
thing that you had to face the challenge of like, well, you know what, even with all this experience, getting a job was a little challenging, and that probably was contributed to by the fact that in the world it was a challenging time to find a job. But how did you make sure where you were going wasn't going to be like a place you didn't want to be?
Yeah, so um, actually, what I found really important, the lessons that I learned from this was, you should s- you should know before you even apply for the jobs. And obviously, I didn't do this. Now, this is me in retrospect realizing I should do this according to what I'm gonna say now. Is that before you apply, you should know exactly where you value yourself in terms of your pay and the lifestyle that you want. So it's like how much vacation you get and things like that, as well as what you enjoy. So for me, I was starting to find like, hey, I'm not really sure if I want to be in the Rails space anymore. Cause and again, like when somebody looks at your LinkedIn, right, they'll say, I have this many years of experience working in React and Rails and all that kind of stuff. That's the only job that they will pin you for, because that's all they see on paper. So all the recruiters, they have their tools that they use to like to crawl all of LinkedIn to get to like headhunt these people. And you're only gonna get offered opportunities in this world, in this sphere. And given my limited experience of just 1 year infrastructure, nobody want no there, it's very rare to have a junior infrastructure role. Everybody wants you to have a minimum of 3 years before they would even consider you on paper. And it's really hard because it's like, uh so where do these infrastructure engineers come from if nobody's taking juniors, right? Because I was open to taking in a junior role if because I want to learn more, but that was like really hard to find. And yeah, I would say you yeah, you got to know your value, you got to know what you want to work in. And for me, it was to work in Golang. I didn't really care as much about the pay. Still, I was still thinking about what problem space do I want to be in and with what tools do I want to use to solve that. And during this entire interview process, I got interviewed for Elixir jobs, Rails jobs, and all that kind of stuff. And they all kind of eventually steered me in that direction that like solidified that like conviction of like, yeah, this is the more of the problem space I want to be in. Um, and yeah, yeah, that's pretty much it. Like it was hard because like, you know, every time somebody interviews you, you don't know the technical interview question or whatever, you feel like, hey, I probably shouldn't have asked for that salary. I suck. I didn't answer that question. I feel like, you know, and then the next person that calls you, depending on the timing, is like, oh, you feel great because you solved an interview question, or you feel crappy for not solving an interview question. So you might, and when you negotiate salary, you might fluctuate on that depending on your mood of that day. So it's just like, again, you just gotta be like very you got to be very clear about what you want. And I think in knowing that, it's much easier when you walk into an interview.
I'm really interested in the idea where you said you were, because of the drastic change in skill set to, you know, in the direction you wanted to explore, and like I said, open up to, you were open to resetting back to a junior, which I can see for many people that, you know, one, it could be hard for their pride to swallow that,
Mm-hmm.
but also just that, you know, like you said, there's pay implications. There's so many different concerns there to be able to make that choice. But the other side of that is you've got such a breadth of experience, and not just technically, but in like you said, the discoveries you've made personally about like where you thrive and where you find engagement and joy, which I think is, you know, not something you're necessarily going to consider very strongly at the outset of your career, but and maybe that's just an age thing. But as you get older, I can definitely appreciate the idea of being willing to reset the levels just to be optimized for fulfillment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's really interesting because you know, I have friends who work at like much higher levels, like director levels and things like that. And they just tell me like, yeah, when I interview um, people who have been in an industry longer, what I notice is somebody who's experienced will always tell me exactly what they want to work on, right? It'll be like very specific, like I want to do back end work with Golang on specifically like this problem domain. And they're like, okay, well, we can find a spot for you. Like, and that, like, that's perfect because it's like, oh, that just, you know, that solves the whole interview too. Like, you know exactly where to place them and things like that. Yeah.
Nice, nice, nice. So we've walked through your story up until where you've landed now. Um, looking back at all of that, what would you say has been the biggest challenge in your career so far?
Oh, yeah. I think something I even struggle with now, but actually just like being confident in yourself, like knowing that, you know, from your experience, you know, you have some value to add in discussions, right? And I think it just comes down to like, you know, you're sitting in a room with a bunch of like people who you believe is like much more senior than you and stuff, and it's just more intimidating to have those technical conversations. But a lot of the times I think it's just very important to know that, hey, these are the things I don't know, but these are the things that I do know. And if I don't know it, it's fine. I just need to be much more comfortable with asking the questions, right? Because really somebody else in the room might not know, might be thinking that same question as well. And yeah, I think it's, again, that's part of like being honest and transparent with everybody you work with, and having a much more of a collaborative environment and like attitude towards building that kind of environment. Because you don't want to solve a problem with a rock star that just makes you feel dumb. You want to solve problems with a friend that like is also interested in your opinion on how to solve that problem. Yeah.
Nice, nice, nice. And looking back at all of that, like with that in mind, do you think there's anything you would have done differently given the chance?
Ooh, what I would have done differently. Honestly, like I would say if I had more time, I would probably do more side projects. But like this is another thing regarding like interviews and things like that. Like when you are being interviewed, in a way you're also interviewing them and trying to see like, hey, do I like this company's interview process? Because this interview process tells me about their work ethic and their culture and things like that, right? So what I found really interesting was just like, there are, I'll say straight up, I don't prefer like those like multi-stage technical interviews. It's like very mentally exhausting, and it's usually like luck of the draw, right? It's you either know this domain really well or you don't, and it depends on what you studied for, right? You might know how to traverse a tree very well, we might not. But uh yeah, but sorry, I lost track.
That's okay. Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting what you kind of say there, that you get off got a little bit into the way, the challenges of some of these different interview processes, but also, like you said, like how much time you have in your personal life to do projects, to prepare, to look at other things, because it's just, yeah.
Yeah. So what I was saying is like, so the company that I'm working for now, which I really enjoy, is that their interview process was, we want to know what you're capable of, and we don't care about your background as much, right? What's on paper and your background did make us more interested, but we still want to just know what you're capable of. So here's a technical assignment, and hand it to us whenever you like, and then we'll just have somebody review it. And if we like the way you code and like how you coded it, then like great, you passed, right? So it's like and that's why I feel like I managed to get this role and able to code in Golang now, because I don't have extensive Golang experience on paper, but I did work on it in side projects and things like that. So I knew that, hey, from my like 4.5 years of software experience now, like I understand overall how software works and all these kinds of things. And I can think about like what kind of software can I write that's easy to extend on, or like that's like very well like just organized. So I will just apply all of these concepts that I learned, but just to a brand new language. So like in doing this project, I can show that I'm capable of learning something new, because I don't work with Go as much, and that here's my years of experience like transferred to that project.
Yeah, it's the more I think about interviewing and interviewing processes, I think in many ways interviewing processes are somewhat quite effective at filtering out bad candidates. But I've really yet to experience personally a interview process that identifies great candidates. Or it's not as good at that as it is. It's like, there's something to be said about like, a good interview process protecting from the wrong fits. But I think the cases where good candidates are discovered is kind of like more of your traditional career path, where there is a previous relationship or previous knowledge of someone's skill and how they work. It's like it can be quite a challenge, because the thing about coding is that it's hard to tell from someone like doing a few problems on a whiteboard, even if it's multi-hours, like how good they are at a job and how good they are to work with. It's like, and I at least have very much appreciated organizations that have done like, a 1 or 2 week paid trial, because I think it's very difficult to get that data from a conversational brain puzzle type interview, even if there's take-home assignments, which I think are better than a lot of whiteboarding type interviews for a lot of roles. There's still, it can be very difficult to understand the contributions that someone can make.
Yeah. And I 100% agree with you. I think like hiring somebody with like a longer probation period is like the way to go, because you also don't know how long some people take to ramp up, but once they ramp up, they're like producing like at a really quick rate. And all these other factors, like if I hire somebody in only for 2 weeks and I give them permission to my infrastructure, and then they just like tear it down, then it's like, oh my god. Like there are a bunch of other things to consider, but yeah, I think that's a much more effective way, having trial periods and things like that.
Yeah. Nice. So just sort of wrapping up with my sort of final question for you. If you could go back in time and talk to your past self and give yourself any advice after graduating from the boot camp, what would it be?
Just be calm down. I was like even now I feel like I'm much more of like I'm much better than before, but like I think just overall tend to second guess myself. And it's really interesting because it's like in the world of code, if the test fails, the test fails, right? And stuff like that. Or like if you write this, there's only, it's like very deterministic usually on how like you do this input and you get that output. But like in some weird way, I kid you not, there are still days where like I write something, it works, and I still second guess myself, like, oh, is this actually done in the way it should be? Like, oh my God, this is bad code. I swear it's bad. And then it's just like, dude, calm down. Like, you've already gotten here. Like, it's fine. Like, even if it's not good, trust your coworkers that you work so well with to tell you that it's not good, and just learn from that. Like, it's okay.
Yeah, it's like it's kind of it's a tricky balance there, because ultimately it's like you could describe it as being unkind to yourself, which
Mhm.
can cause a lot of different issues, psychologically, physically, health wise, and stuff like that, and just how you progress through your career. But I think it's for some people that's how they see themselves driving their growth. Now, whether there's
Mhm.
other fuel sources for that growth is something that the individual would reflect on themselves. But I think to varying degrees, everyone has their version of like what they believe fuels their growth, and that to varying levels has a positive or negative impact on their psychological, emotional, well-being as they pursue through their career.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what actually the really unfortunate thing, like when you were talking about like finding a great candidate, right? And I think it could potentially be subjective, but I think the really, to me, what I find really interesting is like somebody who writes code that's thoughtful and considerate of other people, right? It's like it kind of ties back into like the whole theory of DevOps, right? Like it's like when I build an app, like is it easy for somebody on the infrastructure team to like just set it up and release, or things like that? Like it's all about like building things in a way where it's easy for somebody to understand or maintain or to work with. And like that's really hard because when people are working on things, they can tunnel vision. Like I'm not saying that like I'm not saying like there are people who actually write perfect code or whatever, but it's an iterative process. But it's just like as you're iterating, those are the things that's always on the top of your mind. Like, how do I make sure that when I build this, the next time somebody wants to use this or extend on this, they don't have to know 5 extra steps in order to make this work? And I feel like that's like really great to find in somebody, right?
Yeah, I think one of the hallmarks that I personally believe signifies someone that's definitely well on their way to mastering their particular discipline in the field of software development is their ability to strive for simplicity and achieve it.
Yeah.
Like it's like I've always loved when I've worked with someone who has written code that's so simple that a junior could review their pull request and immediately understand what they've done. And it creates this like almost illusion that like, oh, that's how easy that is. But like personally for me, I've found that arriving at that simple place takes an enormous amount of work.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's
and
this.
and and it's even like how you frame the problem too, right? Like for example, if somebody submits a pull request of like thousands of lines of code, it's going to be really daunting for somebody to review, right? But like if you have a pull request of like just a few hundred, not like a few hundred lines of codes or even less, you're just like, oh yeah, yeah, this is a very small scoped problem that I can work with.
Nice, nice.
And I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it's been great today. Thank you very much for your time. I've appreciated you sharing all your insights and your journey so far. And yeah, thank you very much for
Yeah.
giving me the time today.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much.
Awesome.
It was nice seeing.